turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Eileen. And I appreciate all of you who've maybe returned. I recognize a few names, so thank you for coming back for session 2. Yeah, we'll talk about building our accessibility testing process. This won't get so much down into the weeds of testing different things like headings and alt text, but because often if we start there, we find that folks really kind of miss the big picture and are still kind of wondering where to go. So we typically start here. So I'm happy to provide any other feedback on specific accessibility testing practices if you just send me an email or whatever after this. But with that, I'm going to start in, if my PowerPoint will cooperate, and let you know a little bit about me, first of all, for those of you who are just joining us this first time. So my name is Lyssa Prince, as Eileen mentioned, and she gave you my bio, so I'll kind of leave that alone. But I have a picture on the screen of myself and my dog, who I call my co-trainer. She's laying right next to me sleeping, so hopefully she cooperates this session. I am a white woman in my early 30s. I have bangs, which are actually pulled back in a headband today, and longer hair than in this photo, and glasses. My dog is Penny. She's a yellow Labrador, and I love her to death. And I typically talk about dogs and whatnot when I do examples. So felt it was appropriate to put a dog in the picture with me today. All right, so before we get started, I'd like to kind of ask you first a question to kind of, figure out what you may be doing as far as accessibility testing. So the question to you all is, how many of you currently do some form of accessibility testing? And it is a pretty small group, so I really don't mind if you unmute, but you can also put any feedback you have in the chat. Got one thumbs up. Awesome. Got a little bit, I do. Okay, so for those of you who said yes, are you testing your own organization's content, or are you working with outside clients who are asking you to do accessibility testing? Your own, okay, perfect. Okay, thanks, awesome. All right, that's good to know. Oh, got one that says sites are audited by the university, very interesting. All right, so most of you, it sounds like, are doing your own testing, or you're actually having someone kind of help guide you through it if you're in a university setting. So it's really helpful for me to know. We actually at AbleTech do a little bit of both. So we test our own organization's content. So that ranges from our websites to any newsletters we're putting out to Word documents, PDFs, the whole range of things. So we do try to make sure that we're helping out our team with our own accessibility, but we also do testing for outside clients as well. So the things that we've learned, especially working with outside clients, I think has been super valuable in helping us figure out how best to get this feedback to people, because that's really the thing that is the biggest struggle. It's, you can find all these issues, but how do we actually get them fixed? Like that's the root of what we're trying to get to, right? All right, my PowerPoint really is just being finicky today. All right, so we're gonna head today, our roadmap. We're gonna start with choosing your testing checklist, and I put a plural on that because sometimes you're gonna wanna have different checklists depending upon a variety of things. We're gonna next talk about setting up your toolbox. So if any of you are currently using tools or kind of are more curious about them, this section is probably gonna help you kind of set up your framework and know what things you can include in your testing toolbox. Then we're going to talk through choosing your sample, which is one of the most important pieces when it comes to testing websites. It's very cumbersome and unwieldy to test a whole website in particular. So we kind of talk through how to choose a good sample. And then we'll talk about testing and logging your results, reporting your findings, and then what I call the bread and butter of your testing process is providing that ongoing assistance. So within your own organizations, that's going to be a little easier because or at least I hope it is. I hope that you're not in an organization that's not accepting your feedback as you're going through this testing, but hey, seeing weirder things happen in the accessibility space. So All right, so let's start with choosing your testing checklist. So another question to you all is, where do you see checklists used and why are they used? So do any of you have any good examples of when checklists are used well and why they may be put in place? Just give everybody a couple more seconds to pop in a response if you like. No takers this time, huh? That's okay. All right. Oh, got one. So to keep testing consistent across documents, programs, websites tested. Yes, you're on to me. So I just wanted to kind of have you start thinking through some checklists and maybe, understand a little bit why we're coming from this. So exactly, just because it is something a lot of people don't necessarily do, like, especially in the field of accessibility, there's so many things you could be testing. You really need to start with a checklist and kind of go from there, and then add things, remove things as you see fit, So anyway, one thing I think of when I think of checklists is airline pilots. They have these extensive checklists and they prevent errors as well. So not only are you being more consistent with your testing results, you're making sure you don't miss anything. And that's actually what Keith just put in the chat as well. So you're reading my mind apparently. So yeah, making sure you don't miss things, making sure nothing's overlooked. So checklists are very important. There are a ton of them out there. So I want to show you a little bit about ours, and you can use these. I'll share them with the slide deck after this presentation's over, whether in a link format or just send them along. So we'll figure that out after we get done here. But anyway, we have two checklists that we use. We have our high impact checklist, and we have our full WCAG 2.1 checklist, which the second one is more of a full compliance angle. So depending upon your organization, that one may be the better one to utilize because they're looking at it more from a compliance angle. However, that's the one we prefer to do less because it is so much more cumbersome. It typically overwhelms the folks we're handing our assessments to and reports to. And sometimes those things can't be fixed by the folks we're talking to. So we'll get a little bit more into those details as we go along today, but I really want to focus more on our high impact checklist. So our high impact checklist is made up of the most common barriers that we see across the web. We didn't just get that from our data, we actually took it from some leaders in the field, Tenon and DQ. So I don't know if any of you have heard of those companies. They both are producers of testing tools, and they took some very intensive looks at the results that you can get from testing with automated tools versus manual testing. And they saw where they overlapped. And they also got a lot of the information about what is commonly wrong with sites across the web as far as accessibility goes. So we took that information and kind of drilled it down and made it into our own little checklist that we like to use to get people started, especially. So, we may end up doing a full WCAG 2.1 or 2.0 checklist, depending upon, in our state, I mentioned this last time, but we're actually referring to Section 508, which only references 2.0. We try to get people to go to 2.1 if they can, but it's not always possible. So anyway, we start with the high impact, mostly because it gives results faster, it takes less of our time, and we can spend the bulk of our time with our clients and within our own organization, working with the folks to actually fix these issues. And that's really what we're after, right? We're trying to make these changes happen. So an assessment's nothing without actually making the changes occur. All right, so let me show you really quickly our checklist. I'm going to start with our high impact. So we actually just use this as a checklist that we log our issues into. So we'll talk a little bit more about logging later. There are other options for you to log your results, but right now we're just on a spreadsheet format because we just find it's the most easy to use for us. So we have 18 checks. And for those of you who've done some testing already, these are probably going to start sounding familiar, but our first kind of group is about keyboard accessibility. So a lot of these are things you actually have to go test manually. You can't have a tool test for you, and we'll kind of cover that a little bit later too. But we kind of group these sort of high level. So there may be different things that we're checking for within each of these, but we're looking at this kind of from a systematic perspective, a usability perspective. So we're saying, all right, are our users going to be able to get into these interactive elements or get to them and use them? So we're kind of combining a couple of different important keyboard testing elements into one. So this is where we start. We'll typically pick about 4 or 5 pages to do this testing on. And we'll talk about components here in a second. But that is, we typically start with about 4 or 5 pages, and we'll kind of go from there. And this really typically gives us a pretty good estimation of what's wrong with the site and gets people started. Okay, now let's move over to our other checklist. And, again, this is kind of where people start to get really overwhelmed. So please know that it takes a person quite a while to get to the point of being able to test all these things. We've been recently developing a self-paced course on accessibility testing. And, as someone who's been doing this for a little bit, I'm having to remind myself of all the things I had to do to get from point A to point B. And anyway, so I just don't want anyone to be overwhelmed. That's really what this talk is trying to alleviate, actually. All right, so first with our big assessment, we also typically charge for these, by the way, because they do get to be where they take at least 10 hours of testing, let alone any work that we do with the client after. But anyway, so we choose our pages or components, which I'll explain a little bit later. We say where they are, we say what type of content they have on them. So this is something that can help you when building your sample. Like if you're saying that there's a specific type of content on there, or a different way that they're kind of laying out the page, that might be a page you want to consider. We typically do more pages and components in these, but typically more on the component side. Pages, we still typically stick with 4 or 5 pages. We give an estimate of the time that it takes to actually do the actual assessment on there. And I know I always get a question of how much time does it actually take to test? And that it's a really it depends question. We joke that we should get shirts that say it depends, because we say this all the time. But for a page, you often hear estimates, and you'll hear me kind of echo this. It's about 1 to 2 hours per page, depending upon the content that's on there, if you're doing this full checklist. So anyway, just kind of walk through that. And then at the end, we actually kind of go through and put the priority issues in as we're kind of seeing the same things over and over. And this kind of helps us start narrowing down the things that are commonly wrong with this site. So we'll start putting these in here so that we can later put them into a different report, which I'll go over in a second. All right, but this is the actual checklist. So we have it broken down by guidelines, success criteria, and which WCAG version it actually lies in. And then we'll put a status on it, which is pass, warning, failed, or not present, and then actually explain the issue. So we do this for our 4 or 5 pages, and then we may have other components too. So again, we'll kind of talk about components a little bit later, but this component idea really changed the game for us and how we actually tested. So it's a really important piece. Okay, so that was just a quick look at our own checklist, which then turned into our logging reports as well. And I did want to let you know there are other checklists out there. So tons and tons of checklists. And for those of you who've been kind of looking into this, you probably have seen tons and tons of accessibility information out there. So these are some that we like, and I would highly recommend, you can use ours again. We're going to share those, but these are really good learning tools. So as somebody who came into the field a few years back, and there's not really a formal way to get into accessibility or learn about it, you learn by looking at the resources that are out there. So the first one is the Web Accessibility Initiative. And those are the people that put out the WCAG standards. If you'll remember back to our first session. So they kind of give you the low-hanging fruit, the easy things to check, or the things that are pretty commonly issues, so they're kind of using that same idea that we do. And we took a lot of influence from them as well. So that's a really good one. The A11Y project. And by the way, do all of you know what A11Y means? Or should I stop and explain that really quickly, because I find not everyone knows what that means. Okay, it means accessibility, yeah. So yeah, it is kind of, it's not an acronym, it's a numeronym. So it basically means that there are 11 letters between A and Y in the word accessibility. So that is kind of the standard way of just saying you're doing accessibility. So you'll see that hashtag on Twitter a lot, like hashtag A11Y or whatever. So yes, that's a way to describe accessibility. Okay. The WebAIM checklist is great. I know I mentioned them last time too. WebAIM is a really good resource. They have a testing guide kind of that I think was recently put out. And then they also have their checklist that ours is based off of. So we took WebAIM's checklist for the 2.1 checklist and meshed that into an Excel version that we like to use. DQ is another good one. And if you want a governmental related one, the 18F GSA checklist is good as well. And then the last one is what I couldn't remember in the last session, the WCAG quick reference. For some reason, it slips my mind. But this is the resource that goes along with the standards that can really help you learn about all of those WCAG criteria. So, you can kind of just go through these at your leisure and see which ones speak to you, which ones don't, kind of see how different people do this, because ultimately, checklists are important and you need to use one that's actually going to be accessible to you. All right, one other thing I want to talk about with checklists is considering the job role. So there are a variety of different types of people that make or are involved in the making of content, whether that's a document or a website or web application. So content managers may be able to go in and edit a site in WordPress, for instance, but they're not developers, right? They don't have those skills to go in and actually manipulate the code on the back end. So we have these different roles that are present in every bit of web content that goes on the internet. So I would highly recommend checking out this accessibility roles and responsibilities mapping resource. I don't have time to get into it too much today, but it's able to kind of show you what different areas of the WCAG success criteria can correspond to which roles. So if you're in an organization where you're working with developers to help build a new website, the developers may have a different checklist than you as somebody who is a content manager, or a different checklist than someone who's designing. So not to overwhelm you with this idea, but I kind of want to bring it back down now to say, there could be the options for you to create all of these different types of checklists for the different roles. But the other side of that coin is that you shouldn't be working off of a checklist that is out of your control, that you don't know how to test for, or that you can't fix. And this will come into play a lot during your testing process. Just that idea of what can I fix versus what I can't, or what can they fix versus what they can't. So we'll see that come back up a few times. And I want to talk about how that kind of corresponds to an onion. So I know people use onions for all sorts of layers analogies, but there are a lot of layers to accessibility. So the checklist I showed you second may be super overwhelming to you. So don't start there. There's nothing wrong with that. Start with one of those more simple ones and just keep adding on layers as you learn more things. It takes quite a bit of time, quite a bit of effort, quite a bit of trial and error to get to a point where you're really comfortable testing all of those technical things, even if you're not a developer, because I am not a developer, but I've at least advanced enough to where I can, get in there and see what the code's doing and figure out maybe how this should work. but then I can't tell them how to fix the code necessarily. So anyway, there are varying degrees of accessibility knowledge out there. So just start where you can, start where you are. All right, does anyone have any questions on that piece before we move on? No? I know it takes a second to type, but again, feel free to unmute if you'd like to. That's easier for you. Okay. I do not see anybody typing. Well, actually I can't because Zoom doesn't let me see that, but it will. All right, so let's talk about setting up your toolbox now. So this is where things start to get really interesting, I think. You have different types of automated tools. Some of you probably have used some of these before. There are tons and tons of them out there. So again, I feel like in the accessibility field, it's like cutting through all the noise and just starting somewhere. So the ones that we use fairly often, we use kind of a variety. Again, we have our own little toolbox, but Wave is one we like to start with when we're training folks because it does provide you a lot of feedback and training material kind of as you're using it. Now, most of these single page tools also have a site-wide or enterprise level tool that corresponds to them. So for instance, the one that corresponds to Wave is Pope Tech. So Wave is developed by WebAIM and Pope Tech is a different company, but they use Wave technology. So all of the results that you are seeing look like Wave. And they have the same language as Wave. So if you're familiar with Wave, Pope Tech is a really good enterprise level tool. Now, those obviously typically have a cost versus the single page checkers, but they both have their place. So have any of you used Wave or any other single page checkers? If so, will you let me know kind of which ones you're using? I've got somebody thumbs up, cool. Awesome. Got one Wave. Site Improve, awesome. I don't hear many people using Site Improve, but it is a really good tool. All right, awesome. So those are I think are the most. I mean, I hate to keep using the word accessible, but those are the two that I feel like are most accessible to people who are just getting into the fields. Site Improve and Wave. All right, is anybody using an enterprise level tool? Oh, I've got one for Sort Site too. I haven't heard too much about that one, Kelly. But... Okay, so you're using Site Improve for the site-wide level. Very cool. Moncito, it's another one. Very similar to Site Improve, I hear. Okay, awesome. Well, that's really cool that you're using some enterprise level tools. A lot of people are not using those, so I really am always excited to hear people who are. All right, so these vary very differently in how they work. So, you know, the single page checkers are free and they just require you to kind of go through each one individually. And they're typically going to help you out with your manual testing. So, like with Wave, it'll tell you all the results for errors, alerts, and kind of just tell you some more information about your site. But it's still up to you to go make sure those results are correct. You know, a lot of the time we hear that, well, this page isn't accessible because it has this many Wave errors. Well, what if that Wave error is actually not really a true error? What are we doing then? So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, but there is a big difference between these tools. All right, so some pros of some of the automated tools. They typically will increase your efficiency by a lot, even if you're just using those single page checkers, because they can tell you a lot of information about your page very quickly. For those enterprise level tools in particular, they can really help you keep an eye on your site's pulse, you know, so are you making improvements to your accessibility as you're going along? So it's that big overarching view. You know, you're going to have to do that manual testing alongside this automated testing to make sure anything happens to make the site more accessible. But you can still see on those things that those automated tools can get to if your site's improving or not. We actually use our enterprise tool, which is Pope Tech in this case, for targeting our manual testing. So often if we get a site in that we want to review, we'll take Pope Tech, put the site in and kind of see what the results are. So if we see that there are a lot of errors here, or a lot of particular things on these certain pages, those might be the pages we choose in our testing scope. So once we started kind of trying to refine our process, that was something we really realized was helpful to us, at least in the work that we do, just helping us figure out where we may need to go look a little bit more deeply. And then I think another thing that these enterprise level tools can do is provide bulk details on particularly content accessibility, because it can do a lot of things like with headings and alt text and links. It can provide really good bulk details on those things. So we try to rely more on our manual testing for those template level things, like is your header properly structured, is your footer properly structured, the rest of the site. It's where the manual testing really comes in, but for the automated tools, I really think they do well with the content side. All right, diving into the cons of automated tools, they typically cost a lot of money if they're enterprise level. So Pope Tech, and I'm not sure what Site Improve and those other ones cost. I've seen Level and DQ a few times with different organizations around Oklahoma, but Pope Tech's typically one of the most affordable ones. It's part of why we like them, because they're just a little more available for folks. But I think that there is definitely a pro to having them, but it's not necessary either. So, you know, don't take from this conversation that you absolutely have to have an enterprise tool. They can just be helpful. Another thing that automated tools, both single page and enterprise level tools, can do is present false positives. So it's actually saying there's an error when there's really not. We're going to go over some examples of that here in a second. But the other thing, and I've alluded to this a few times, but automated tools can only show you part of the potential barriers that you have on your site for accessibility. So got an iceberg up here. So, you know, just don't let yourself be like the Titanic and hit this iceberg. The manual testing is going to find typically a lot more underneath that surface than these automated tools can. So, you know, they're great. They can help you out so much, but just please don't rely on them. All right, so let's go over some examples of what these tools can and can't find. So this is really the only time we're going to delve into some actual talk about testing. If we have time, I'm going to go over some wave structure too, to kind of show you how we test headings or something like that, but we may just not have time. Okay, so for headings in particular, tools can find whether or not headings are defined. So wave, for instance, will say, hey, there are no headings on the page. It'll also say, hey, there's a multiple heading ones, things like that. It'll also tell you if there's skipped headings. But even the best tools cannot tell you if that heading structure actually makes sense. So does the content that's on the page actually need to be marked as a heading 1 or a heading 2 or a heading 3 or so on? So that's still something you have to check manually, even if these tools are telling you that everything is okay. So there's always, you know, a give and take with this manual and automated testing. For color contrast, these tools can actually find pretty precisely whether there are color contrast issues on text with a plain colored background, and that last piece is very important. It can't find any color contrast issues on text that are on gradients or that have images for backgrounds. So that's something you have to go find for yourself. So that's when we really suggest using Color Contrast Analyzer from Paciello Group. And I'm going to write that down to pop in the chat later. So that is a very important thing. So like you may be thinking, well, my tool's telling me there are no color contrast issues, but you have a hero image on the top of every page that has a low color contrast with the text that's on top of it. So something you're definitely going to have to check out with a manual tool or, you know, with your own eyes. All right, for alternative text, the tools can tell you whether or not alternative text exists. Is it actually, does this image have alternative text noted, or does it have null alternative text noted? Can tell you that. They cannot tell you whether alternative text is meaningful. And I also listed accessible names too. So that goes a little bit deeper into the idea of interactive components typically. But anyway, so it can't tell you whether those things actually make sense. So that's something you have to go check. And that's another reason why I really like Wave, because it'll actually display that alt text for you so you can check it right in line with the page. All right, so that, I feel like I need to pause there because that's a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions on this piece up to now? Quiet group today. Must be the heat. Eileen and I were talking this morning and it sounds like it's just as hot in Missouri as it is in Oklahoma. Everybody wants to take a nap. All right, let's move on then. So how many issues can automated tools catch? The research that we actually kind of relied on for our high impact checklist was from DQ, and they actually measured it a little bit higher than the previous estimates at 57.38%. And and Angela's saying 100 plus in Texas. Y'all, I'm so sorry. We're supposed to get to 100 by the end of the week, and that's I'm just not looking forward to that. It's awful. So I apologize to you guys in Texas. It's brutal. Okay, so 57.38%, which is actually a pretty high number. So you may be thinking, well, Lyssa, you're telling us, the automated tools can't do a whole lot, but that's a pretty high number. But again, we're thinking 43 point something percent of automated issues that it cannot catch. And these are also, have to make the caveat, these are detectable errors. So these are things that we know the tools can catch. So it adds a little bit more nuance to it and kind of makes that number not quite as impressive, but it's still pretty decent. So that's why they can really increase that efficiency, right? They're able to tell you a lot of information really, really quickly. All right, so another thing, and this is, if any of you are curious about this data too, the error patterns on the modern web, I think this is a YouTube video. I saw it presented live at a conference one time and mine was blown, but apparently 7 of the top 10 failing success criteria are shared between automated and manual testing. So what that means is there is a really standard list of issues across the web that are typically wrong with sites. So that's why we can isolate to these smaller checklists and still probably do a pretty good job of catching the issues that are actually present on a website. So anyway, this is really cool research and I highly encourage you to look at that if you get a chance. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about role again. So I told you this is going to come up a few times, but I think there are some tools that are better for folks who are less technical and some that are better for more technical folks. So Wave, Site Improve, and Microsoft Accessibility Insights are the ones that we typically see people succeed better with from the get-go than these other tools, which are like Axe, Arc Toolkit, Google Lighthouse. Now, I also included Microsoft Accessibility Insights in this one. There are some pieces of it, if you do like a full check, they get fairly technical. So I think it does a good job of leading people through an accessibility test. So it's a really good learning tool, but some of the elements of it are a little technical. So that's why it's kind of in both. There are some really cool pieces of it, Microsoft Accessibility Insights though. For any of you that are checking keyboard tab order, it'll actually number off the different interactive elements as you're tabbing through. So we use this tool actually pretty commonly to show a screenshot, like if we're seeing a keyboard tab issue where something is actually reached in an incorrect order versus what the visual order is. We actually take a screenshot of that and include it in our report so that folks who are receiving that report can actually pretty quickly visually see where the issue is. So some of these tools we actually use not just for testing itself, but to help us with our reporting. Our toolkit does a very similar thing to that, by the way. So know, I can really geek out on tools, y'all. So I kind of get too in the nitty gritty sometimes about them. But I do think it's important for you to take a look at the different tools, compare and contrast them, and then choose the one that you like best. We typically use Wave and Axe in combination because we think that gives pretty good coverage of both that overarching site information with also that more technical code check that Axe provides. So we definitely use multiple tools and not just one. So, but I will also caution you against using all of these tools at once on a site, because you're just going to go, why are they all disagreeing? They're all kind of giving you similar results, but slightly different. So please don't go just use all these. If you want to go test them out, I would recommend just kind of doing them one at a time rather than against each other on a site. Don't do what I did. All right, manual tools. Let's talk a little bit about those too. So some tools there are available can help you with your manual testing as well. Those are things like bookmarklets. So Paul J. Adam and a variety of other people have these bookmarklets, which just sit in your bookmarks bar of your browser and can allow you to turn on and off things. So we use the Force Focus bookmarklet all the time. And this is really helpful if you're testing a site that doesn't have any keyboard focus indicators. So if you're tabbing through a site and trying to see if the keyboard accessibility is accurate, then and the focus indicator is missing, it'll turn one on for you, so you can at least test the tab order and make sure that everything is reachable and usable. Because, you know, for those of us who are sighted and testing, we need to see where we are and make sure that things are in the correct order. Okay, another thing you can look at is the W3C WAI list of accessibility tools. It's a little bit outdated, but this is the most comprehensive list I know of that shows a list of accessibility testing tools. They'll kind of tell you whether or not they're like single page checkers or whether they're bookmarklets or things like that. Digital A11Y has another list of bookmarklets that just works slightly different than the Paul J. Adam ones. And I can illustrate that too here in a little bit if you guys are curious. And another thing that we use all the time is Chrome Zoom Text Only. So this is when we're testing zooming text only versus zooming the whole entire page. So those are two different things and you want to test both angles. The Chrome doesn't have a built-in feature to zoom your text by itself. Firefox does. So these kinds of tools are super helpful. So, you know, again, takes you a minute to develop your toolbox. There are tons of them out there, and you know, you can always ask questions of those who, you know, like me, who've kind of waded through all of this. Like, I'm happy to let you know what might work for you, depending upon if you're testing in Chrome or Firefox or whatever. So, you know, just don't feel bad about asking questions of myself or any other person in the field who does testing a lot. Another thing to think about is using screen readers and assistive technology to test. So now I'll caution you that if you're not like an expert AT user, you're likely going to get a different experience just because, you know, you're not super proficient at the actual tool you're using to test. But the screen readers I have on the page are NVDA, which is free or donation-based, JAWS, and then VoiceOver on the Mac environment and iOS environment. So, and as far as other AT, you know, you all may have access to test with different devices. I know at AbleTech we have the demo loan program that we can actually go retrieve things from and use to test. And we'd really like to start integrating that more, but we're just not to the point where we can. We're still at a pretty small team. So that's actually one of my goals in the next few years, to try to get a little bit more testing done with AT. But again, if you can have users who are proficient at these tools test for you instead of you doing it for yourself, you're likely going to get a more representative experience. So that's what I'd recommend. All right, so just like with the onion analogy earlier in the checklist, you're going to use the tools that you like best and don't overwhelm you. So just start with a couple and then figure out which ones work for you and just use those going forward. If you decide some things, you know, as your knowledge grows, if you decide something better is out there, by all means, change out your tools. but it doesn't have to be a static thing. So just start where you are and keep moving along. All right, let's talk about choosing a sample now. So this is where I don't have as many examples to give you. So these will be kind of brief, but the first thing we try to do is talk to the content owner. So for those of you who are working within your own organizations, you may be the person that you'd be talking to, right? You may be the person that you, or that knows best about the website and the content that's on it. But the questions to ask yourself or the client, in case you're working with a client or someone else in your organization, is what's the most crucial or most used content? So these pages, even if they're not necessarily even accessed that often, if they're like, for instance, to register to vote, but that one's probably a really bad example because that one should be used often. I hope it is anyway. But if it's something that's not used super often, but is super crucial information, like somebody applying for maybe a kind of benefit or something that's not often applied for. Those are pages you want to consider adding to your sample. So again, I keep saying 4 or 5 pages for a test, but it's really going to depend upon your content. So if you have, 6 pages that are just absolutely crucial to your users, you still probably need to include those. So your sample is going to grow a little bit. The other thing to think about is what are your workflows? So do you have a login process? Do you have a shopping checkout process? Those kinds of things. Workflows are things we typically want to test from point A to point B. So we'll often account for that in different ways depending upon the site. And most of the sites that we test don't have something like that except for a login. But then you make sure just to add the login page and you're pretty much done with that workflow. But again, those are the thoughts that you're kind of having, like what would make a huge impact to a user if it was inaccessible? Those are the pages you needed to add. The other thing that we ask is what components are used. So that leads me into the conversation I've been alluding to for this whole presentation is what is a component? So this sounds like a technical word, but I assure you, we can break it down into a non-technical level. So my definition of it is a component or pattern is a piece of functionality commonly used across multiple pages of a website. So for a long time, websites have typically been built in such a way that these things are reusable across a whole website. So not only does your header and footer, not only are those the same on each page, you're also seeing the same buttons, the same accordions, the same calendar features that are just kind of used in multiple places. So that's what I want you to start thinking about. So let's actually take a look at some sites real quick. Got about 15 minutes left, so I think this would be a good use of time. Switch over. Okay, got our thing up. Let's start. I like to start on Amazon's homepage just because it's one of the more flashy ones. All right, so if we're thinking about that idea of components, what kind of components do we have on this Amazon homepage? All right, we've got someone saying a carousel. Yep, exactly. Banners, menus, items. So those can definitely be things that we can consider components. Yeah. I want to come back to the items one here in a second. Suggestions for things to buy. Okay. And I'm going to scroll down the page, and y'all feel free to go to Amazon if I'm not on the part of the page you want to go to. Just scroll down here a little bit. All right, so anybody have any other guesses? And no wrong answers here for sure. Okay, give you a couple more seconds. doesn't look like anyone else wants to chime in. That's fine. Search box. Oh yeah, perfect one. So search is one. So we're going to start kind of just going down the page from here. So someone said search. Lizabelle, thank you for that contribution. Menu. This is up here at the top. This menu is going to be standard pretty much across the whole site. Oh, didn't mean to click the space bar there. We have this first carousel at the top, which is just showing kind of some highlighted products. And then below that, we have a different carousel, which has like a summaries of your accounts and things like that, it looks like. So like your summary, whether you want to buy it again. So some things like that. We have another carousel down here that has items in it. So technically speaking, you could break this down many different ways. So we have 3 different types of carousels that are drastically different. So we're going to have to call those carousel 1, 2, and 3. So if we just take this top page, so we have search bar or search box menu, carousel number 1 with the highlighted item, like the account summary carousel, and then the related items carousel. So we've got lots of carousels. And then we could also break it down into an item here. So this is actually something we want to make sure these are constantly working. But we don't have to get this granular either. This is something you're typically going to be able to test as a content piece on a page that you check. So, you know, this is where it's really hard to give advice on a site that is, or on, you know, just for everyone, because it could potentially differ depending on site you're looking at. That's what I'm really trying to get at. So if you have a very simple site, you might be able to break down into smaller components. But if you have a really giant site like Amazon, you might want to keep it high level like these carousels and not go down to the item level, because you're going to be testing those in other ways on the content pages you're choosing. All right, so if we go down, there are other things than carousels. There's this more items to consider. So like we really need to think about, is there anything different in this one? Is there anything that won't be tested if we don't add this as a component? Because these are kind of like item cards. I don't really know what a developer would call these as they're building them, but yeah. So this is a pretty complex site, but anyway, we can still break it down into those kind of components I mentioned. All right, so what about the BBC? Let's try this one. And some of these elements are going to be the same. So, okay, let's see, let's point out some of the things that are different. So we've got the search in the menu, but what do you guys see down here in the bottom area? I picked some hard sites, y'all, so it's okay. Categories of new items. Yeah, that's one example. So one thing I want to point out is that this looks like it's a bunch of different components kind of put together, but typically these are really just links. So I probably wouldn't add any of the things on the home page as components. Just tabbing through right now. I typically wouldn't add anything as components except for the header and the footer and the menu and things like that up in the top, just because everything else is just content, right? So if we went over to a different page, you know, maybe it looks about the same. So honestly, this BB site is a little bit less complex, but I wonder if there's a difference here. So they actually have these little cards that show more expanded view of an article. They have multiple links in them. So we may want to actually consider calling this a component. I'm not sure what we'd call it. Maybe it's an article card or something like that. But again, this is going to require you to kind of do some sleuthing in the site first to make sure you know enough about what's going on, as well as talking, you know, to other people in your organization or clients about what's important on this page. Like what kind of things do they know could potentially be issues or could present issues. So it's definitely an art, not a science. All right, so let's go back to our slideshow. But the important thing here, I've talked about testing just a few pages, adding the components, kind of getting a slice of the pie here, but you really don't want to test the whole site. Like if we tested every single Amazon page, every single BBC home page, BBC page, that would be a ton of pages. So we really don't want to go that far. All right, so our recommendations, I've kind of mentioned these throughout, but to summarize them here, choose 4 or 5 pages, including maybe the home page, 2 common content pages that are a little bit different, and then one or two, I think I transposed those words, 1 or 2 additional pages that feature different content. So maybe there's a very unique page, and think back to that idea, like what are the crucial pages here? What is a page that's maybe got some unique content, a unique feature, a unique usage, or a really important piece of content that you want to make sure you test? Those are the pages you want to add. Then you also want to include your components separately. So you may have chosen those 4 or 5 pages, but if you have the components lit out, maybe you have the header and the footer and a calendar and accordions, and that becomes your sample. Those are where you want to focus. Now, again, I'll just provide you some resources. We built some of our methodology based on the WCAG evaluation methodology. It's WCAG-EM for short. It's really long and lengthy, so only get into it if you're just really curious about it, but it kind of goes through their idea of how to develop a scope for your testing process. So they recommend different numbers than we do, but ultimately we figured out there's a point of diminishing returns a lot faster than you think when you're testing a site. And then also I want to give credit to Tenon for the component testing model. I mentioned that really changed our game for us, but components are used pretty consistently across the site. And if you focus on testing those in fewer pages, then you're going to have a much faster testing experience, whether or not you're using like a high impact checklist like ours, or one that's more of a full compliance level checklist. All right, so testing the checklist is where we'll head next. So the main idea to take from this is that you're using your testing tools that you've put in your toolbox, plus checking all those things manually that cannot be tested with those automated tools. And then you're also including screen reader and AT testing if you can feel comfortable, or have people who can do this for you. Now, if you don't have people who can do this for you at your organization, there are testers at these companies called Fable and Nobility Access Works that can actually assist you for a fee with testing a site. But the feedback that folks who actually live with these disabilities can give versus someone who's able-bodied, sighted like me is invaluable. So this is again something I'll admit we haven't really been able to do at Able Tech yet. Really want to get there because it would just really strengthen what we're able to provide, because we have to guess a lot of times. We have to guess at how things are going to be experienced. But if you include people with disabilities in your testing, they don't have to guess, they know. All right. So some logging tools I mentioned in our spreadsheet, we just log everything there and we kind of transport it over into a Word report when we're done. But you have a reporting tool from WCAG-EM if you want to use it. It's a little bit complex and it only comes out into a what's called a JSON file, which is very unhelpful. So we chose not to use that kind of when it first came out, when we first found out about it, just because it doesn't produce a report that we can really share with folks. But if it helps you and your organization, by all means, use that. Mortis is a product from Tenon, so it'll really stress that component model if you were to get in and see a demonstration of it. And Hugr, H-U-G-R, all caps, is an open source tool that will help you log. So, you may want to stick with simple like we did, but I just wanted to give you some other options for the some other testing tools that can help you if you would like to see them. All right. I am running out of time, y'all. I spent way too much time on some of these things. All right, report your findings is where we'll head almost last. So your idea with the report, your main idea is to minimize overwhelm. We never send our report out to a content owner until we've reviewed it with them. So we don't want to hand somebody a report that says you've got all these issues and then just make them feel like this is impossible. That's the last thing we want to do. So we'll actually review the report with them and then potentially reprioritize things after we've done so. But yeah, I'll cover that in a second, but add a summary too. Like that's what we make sure and add a summary in the report, kind of saying you do have some accessibility barriers. Here are the things that are most commonly found on your site. And then we try to give them a priority of the priority level of the impact these things are going to have as far as barriers. So we have in our report a scope. So we tell them which pages and components we reviewed, the summary, and then we kind of go through the detailed results that we just pull over from our spreadsheets. And we list some resources to help them too. But again, we're the main resource. We try to be anyway. All right, priority 1, we categorize this as issues that are serious enough to prevent users from accessing the site, or are large scale corrections that could have an impact on many pages. So we're trying to take into account low hanging fruit here too. Priority 2 is issues that may cause problems or increase frustration for many users. Priority 3 is maybe a smaller number of users. So that's where we start when we prioritize in the report that we present to our clients or to our own organization. All right, and I mentioned a second ago that we may reprioritize after we have the meeting with the client, because we really find out if they can fix these things or not. So, oh, I'm so sorry. You guys are still saying the BBC webpage. How weird. Let me start my screen share and I'll start it over again. Oops. I lost Zoom. Share screen. Let's go with this. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes, it's showing.
Okay, so sorry about that. I had no idea. I was bragging on Zoom earlier because they added this new feature and then it failed me, so I apologize. Okay, so prioritization, we might reprioritize these into priority 1, 2, or 3, depending upon if the person we're talking to can fix the issues or not. So if it's something that maybe has a high impact on users, but it can't be fixed by the group of people we're talking to, it may have to go into a lower priority. And then we figure out that later, so we're just trying to get the most issues that we can fixed first. And that all really depends on what's in control of the person that owns the site. Okay, turn this off. Okay, so last thing, and this is just a quick mention, so 1 minute out from time, but like I said earlier, this assessment, it can really make people feel like there's too much to fix. So, we really try to make people understand that this is something we're going to help you break down into, manageable tasks, and we'll sit next to you and work on these things alongside you. So I think that's the most important piece of your assessment process, period, is, you have to do the checking on the site. Just make sure you're actually tagging alongside the people you're working with to make these fixes. So again, that's really your bread and butter. And this slide makes me hungry every time because I love bread and I love butter. So here we are. But if you do this, I think you're going to have a lot more success than if you just hand people a report and expect them to understand it. So it's my biggest piece of advice to you all. All right, so I'm so sorry I didn't leave a whole lot of time for questions, but I am more than happy to stay on late if you all want to do so and answer any questions you may have. And I'll put my information in the chat. So if you have any questions that come up about accessibility testing or anything related to that, just let me know. We're happy to answer questions at any time.